The following program is an independent production, apart from DJDP Productions. The views, opinions, and ideas of the producers of The Darkest Hour do not necessarily reflect those of the staff of DJDP Productions, its partners or affiliates. The producers of The Darkest Hour with Amanda Jane of Forget Me Not assume all responsibility for the content of its program. Should you have questions or concerns regarding The Darkest Hour with Amanda Jane, please contact the producers directly. Or you may also contact the staff at Neo Retro FM through email at djdphoenix@protonmail.com. Be sure to include the date of the program and the subject matter you're inquiring about. And now, Neo Retro FM presents The Darkest Hour with Amanda Jane, streamed live from Marysville, Washington.
For tomorrow, we embark on the darkest hour.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to The Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. You may notice a theme throughout tonight's episode. We hear from several different people from several different parts of the country. Each experience uniquely its own, of course. But the takeaway remains the same. We are not alone. So, let's get started, shall we? I'll start by saying that I believe in other intelligent life forms. I believe that we're not alone. However, I only came to feel this way through the experiences in my life, so I understand if it's hard or even impossible to believe. Regardless, I'll share my experiences here and chronologically because that seems to make the most sense. First, I was 7 or so. Pretty sure it was 1998, when me and my parents were making the drive to visit family in Southern California. Because we started the drive so early and it was winter, it was still dark outside. Usually I got car sick on parts of this drive, so my family would drug me up. At one point on the drive, I woke up and I see a tall hill, and on the tall hill, I see a saucer with a spotlight. The sight scares me. I find myself drifting back to sleep from the fear and probably the Dramamine. On the same drive, I wake up again. This time, it's my family asking if I need to pee or use the restroom. I don't, but my dad takes me with him anyways. I'm standing in the bathroom, just sort of zoning out, waiting for my dad, when I notice a tall man standing in the corner of the bathroom. He's staring at me. He's covered in dirt or dirty clothes, and he says to me, "I know you saw it too," and continued to stare at me. I asked the man, "What was it?" Because in my 6-year-old brain, I knew that he was talking about the saucer and lights. But instead, I hear my dad say, "What, buddy? What was what?" And then I notice the man is no longer in the corner. I'm so tired that I don't think I even answer my dad. Within a few moments, we're on our way back to the car to continue the drive. I can feel that it's hard to keep my eyes open, but just as I'm closing them, I'm sure I see the same man who was in the corner, now standing on the side of the building, staring at our car. But then I'm out. By the time we were almost to my family's, the medication has all but worn off, and I'm now alive, alert, and very excited to play with my cousins. When I try to tell my younger cousins about what I saw on the hill, they tell me that I've had a bad dream. My older cousin says it's the pills my family gave me. And I accept all of this. After all, these visions were in between me sleeping. However, when leaving my cousin's house, I asked my parents not to give me the medication because it made me feel funny last time. They aren't sure about this, but tell me that if I start to feel sick, I need to tell them so they can pull over. I agree. On the ride home, I'm what you would call sober. I don't know how long we were driving before I noticed something in the sky. But I asked my parents if they saw it too. My dad was driving, so he didn't even bother looking, but I remember my mom peering out the window and then doing a double take. She said something like, "Oh, wow." And I asked her what it was. She had no idea, but she started to tell my dad that it was weird. I kept looking at the thing. It was also circular in shape, but I didn't see any spotlights coming down from this one. It was also still partially daylight, so maybe it wasn't visible. My mom tells my dad there's a light on top of it. "Like a moving round flashlight, hun," she says. My dad dismisses this as a plane, saying something about the military. I don't think I knew what he meant, but he sure sounded like he knew. I watched the thing take off very quickly. My mom must have not seen it, as she asked out loud, "Oh, what? Where did it go?" Next time I'd see something that I couldn't explain, it would be 1999 on New Year's Eve. My parents and I would always stay awake and wait for the ball to drop on TV, and then bang pots and pans. This year, there was a lot of hype in the world about whether it was going to end or not at the stroke of midnight. My parents did not let me buy into this, of course, telling me that it would be no different than any of the other years. It was around 11 p.m., and we didn't usually turn on Times Square until closer to midnight, so I was on the computer playing games, while my parents watched the news. Something caught my eye from outside the window, across the street. I looked out and saw in the sky a saucer above the houses across from my apartments. This seems identical to what I saw on top of the hill the winter prior. I could see that it had a spotlight shining on the roof of the house, just as it did atop of the hill. Then I think of what I saw with my mom that same trip, on the way home. I watch it for a while, and I tell my mom to come to the window. Just as she walks over, I watch the craft go dark and essentially disappear out of view. She asks what it was she was supposed to be looking at, and I remind her of a year ago and then tell her what I just saw. She laughs and says, "Yeah, right, here in the middle of the city." She clearly didn't believe me, further dismissing this as fireworks. I remember feeling a bit jaded by this experience, and I decided to go to bed before the ball dropped. The last experience I had was in 2001. My mom had gotten me a cool remote control car from the mall. At the time, it was dark, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to play with it until the next day. But I asked if I could set it up in my room, get the batteries in it, all that good stuff. She gave me her keys and agreed to let me go to the trunk of her car. As I'm running up to the car, I look up and across the street. What I see is something I haven't seen. It doesn't look like the other things I've seen in the sky. This thing covered a huge amount of the sky, and it made no sound whatsoever. Just a huge ship, maybe 2 football fields at least, but round, with 3 huge bright orange lights. It's so huge that I understand I'm only looking at the bottom of this thing, part of the bottom. It's flat, gray-black, and round. I see the large lights begin to move sporadically. I felt a wave of anxiety realizing that I'm in this dark parking lot all on my own, so I jumped into my mom's car and I lock all the doors. I crack open part of the sunroof cover and peer out and watch as this giant yet silent mass floats above me. Eventually, it looks as though it's ascending higher into the sky. I can still see the lights, but everything else becomes much harder to see, until eventually, there's nothing to see at all. Once I saw that the lights were gone, that the entire thing was gone, I booked it back to the apartment. My mom asked where the remote control car was. In that moment, I realized I was so freaked out I didn't even grab it. I told her I would just get it in the morning and decided to keep my story to myself. I don't live in California any longer. My family moved to Oregon in 2003. Since moving, I haven't experienced anything quite like I did those few years. I always found it so interesting that it always seemed to be around the holidays, always in winter. I can't be 100% sure it was the same thing all 3 times, because the last encounter was so up close and personal. It was so much larger than anything else I'd ever seen in the sky. If I didn't see it for myself, I would consider this description to be that out of a sci-fi film. But I can tell you, Scout's honor, that even if I don't know exactly what I saw, I certainly saw something. If anyone else out there has experiences like these, I'm curious. Did you ever get any answers? Just before moving to Washington, several years ago I worked at a bar and grill in South Idaho. I don't know how privacy stuff works, so I'll go ahead and leave out the name of the place. Though, I don't think it'll be hard to find the bar that I'm referring to. There aren't a ton of notoriously haunted places in southern Idaho. At least not that I know of. Anyways, before I'd even applied for the job, I went to the establishment quite a bit. My whole family did. So we had heard the stories about lights turning themselves on and off, unexplained laughter, broken glasses, and much more. Either way, I didn't necessarily believe in all of that stuff. There was also the fact that I'd been to the place many a time, and none of those times had I ever experienced something paranormal, if you will. Glasses broke, sure, but these were people breaking things, not ghosts. Well, I started working there shortly after my 21st birthday. I had another job at a small bakery in town. It was great, but not exactly high-paying, and not quick cash. Bartending was the perfect way to make good, quick cash. And I needed that, since my boyfriend at the time had completely bailed on me, leaving me to pay our entire rent. I figured he likely wasn't coming back, and even if he did, it wasn't like he could actually live with me. So I decided I should apply for the open position. Lucky enough, I got the job. My first shift was the night that I was told I got the job, which was great. First night went off without a hitch. I can honestly say nothing crazy happened. As time went on, this was the same story. I kept being told, "Just wait," by fellow staffers, telling me that when I least expect it, something will happen. All this did was make me hyper-aware, always paying attention to where I put things, always investigating sounds immediately and not getting scared by them. Oftentimes it was explainable. Clearly, some birds lived in the attic or whatever space was between the ceiling and the exterior roof. You could hear them skitter around from up there, from inside, and then you could see them leaving the building if you were outside. I thought for sure this explained the mysterious sounds upstairs I kept being told about. Eventually, I let it go, truly forgetting that this place was supposed to be haunted. It wasn't that hard, as I said. I didn't have any reason to believe in this stuff previously, and I was there to get a job done. I couldn't be getting scared off, especially since I would be taking over some of the closing shifts, requiring me to be there alone a lot later. One of the last things to do when closing is to take out all of the garbage. So I'm going back and forth from the pile of various garbage bags near the bar to the dumpster just outside the back door. Even though I propped the back door open, halfway back to the bar I'd hear it slam shut. I'll admit the first time it scared the crap out of me, but definitely more of a jump scare. I didn't think something was actually closing the door, and I told myself that I didn't feel anything either. The second time it didn't scare me at all, because I just stared at it and saw it slowly start to close and then slam shut. It was one of those super heavy doors, one that the upper springs or hydraulics should help to make it close slowly the whole time. It was broken for sure, but clearly whatever I was using to hold it open wasn't working. So I decided that I wouldn't worry about it and I'd swing it open with every bag. So I continued back and forth until all of the garbage was gone. As I walked toward the back door one last time to lock it, I stopped in place as I watched the door slowly open and then slam shut. Before I could even digest what I was seeing, I hear blaring from the front bar dining area, "Journey's Any Way You Want It." It's playing from the jukebox, and it's the loudest thing I've ever heard. The loudest that this jukebox has ever played before. I found myself running towards it immediately to shut it off, honestly afraid that it might just blow up. It was playing so loud. Just as I got in front of the thing, it shut off entirely. The lights and sound shut off at once, and when I looked, the switch on the back was still set to the off position. I stood there for several moments, and I don't know why, but I found myself saying out loud, "Okay, insert bar name here, you're haunted. Sorry I doubted you all." The rest of the night was normal. No more interactions. I didn't quit the job or anything like that. I knew that wasn't really an option for me, and after talking to my coworkers about it, I learned that I wasn't the first one to experience the jukebox phenomena. One of my coworkers told me I was lucky, that at least it was plugged in when I checked on it. I agreed, but either way, we decided both were unexplainable. By the time I left the place, I would have experienced just about everything people said that I would. The laughter was interesting. It truly sounded like people were laughing from inside the walls. It was muffled, I mean. Regardless of where you were in the building, you could hear this muffled laughter. Like someone took actual bar crowd noise, dialed down the volume so that it could be more background. This was interesting, especially because I heard it when I would open the bar around 9 a.m. and in the evening, whereas the door slams and music antics only seemed to take place at night. I don't live there any longer and haven't been back in ages, but I do keep in contact with the previous owner's son. He still works for the new owners, and he told me that back in 2017, they replaced the jukebox and stereo system with something a bit more up to date, something that would take credit cards and fill the room with sound. Even so, bartenders reported the same type of events, music blaring suddenly, just as they're closing for the night. I still don't know that I believe in all things paranormal, but I trust myself and I trust the people that I worked with about their experiences. And having no explanation does leave me a bit more open-minded about the unknown. Even if it's just accepting the idea that the unknown exists, that we aren't all-knowing all the time, there's something more to it. I personally find that kind of exciting. Maybe a bit scary at first, but exciting nonetheless. I've always been a believer of other life out there. Not firm on what that means exactly, just that we're not alone. Since I was a child, I was fascinated by all things space-related. I was about 9 or 10 years old at the time of this story. I'm 27 now. But I was in my grandparents' backyard. It was late, probably 10 p.m., and I was watching the stars as I often did in their backyard. This night was different. Suddenly, I saw 3 bright balls of light appear. Not right in front of me, like I couldn't feel any heat or anything like that, but closer to me than anything else in the sky had ever been. These balls zoomed around and then formed a triangle shape, where they hovered for several moments. I recall waving towards them like I would if a plane was in the sky. I knew they didn't look like planes, but what else flew around like that? After continuing to hover for several moments, they all shot off and disappeared simultaneously. I was overwhelmed with excitement as I tried to tell my grandparents what I'd seen. They each looked at me like I'd been speaking a different language, but I couldn't find the words to describe what I'd seen at the time, so I let it go. I let it go, but I never forgot it. About 3 years after that event, my grandparents hired me to do some yard work on their property. It was several acres, so it wasn't like they were paying me to do nothing. Either way, a fine way for a 13-year-old to make some extra cash. It was probably around the same time of night, maybe a bit later, when I was laying in their backyard as I usually did, and those same 3 balls of light appeared overhead. It was like a repeat of the time before. Their movements had to have been the same as it felt so familiar. They hovered, but this time, it didn't seem to be for as long before shooting off. But I could see that these things moved like nothing else I'd observed in the sky, and still to this day, nothing like it. I didn't bother asking my grandparents about it, not that time anyway. I continued to work for, but also just go to my grandparents regularly. And for as many times as I laid in that backyard stargazing, those were the only 2 nights I ever saw them. The final and last time would be a sighting in the daytime. And it was different only in that my grandma was standing right next to me when we saw them. We were sitting outside, her telling me the plans for her side yard, the types of plants she wanted me to get, that kind of thing. In my peripherals, I see motion in the sky. Quickly looking up, I notice the same 3 balls once again. I stop my grandma and tell her to look up at the sky to see what I'm looking at. We both sit there a bit mesmerized, and she finally asks me what the heck I think those are. In that moment, I realize that, with all this time to think about it, I hadn't actually thought about it. What exactly did I think these things were? Great question. I still don't really have an answer, but the facts remain. This thing or things have reappeared multiple times. They move like no other, and don't appear to stick around for very long. I don't know. I'm torn between aliens and the government spying on citizens. What do you think? Growing up, it was just my mom, my 2 sisters, and me. My sisters, Anna and Alex, are twins, and they're both 3 years younger than me. When I was about 10, we lived in a small apartment above a nail salon. The apartment was super small, smelled of chemicals and mildew. Aside from 3 girls sharing a very small room, my mom's room was the living room. And during this time, she worked a lot, so my sisters and I were often alone in the apartment, though we didn't always feel alone. The salon owners were pretty strict about one detail, which was noise. We were always afraid to be too loud because we didn't want to get in trouble. They didn't want us living there to be a problem for business, but also wanted to help my mom out. The apartment itself was by far the worst place we ever lived, and luckily, we didn't live there long at all. Just long enough to experience something or things that we would never forget. One day, my sisters and I were watching TV very quietly on my bed with this portable TV that we had. It was pretty crappy, but you could easily watch some free channels, and since it naturally had a horrible sound system, we didn't have to worry about it being too loud. Some Looney Tunes something was playing on the TV, and I remember letting the girls hold it while I laid back on the bed and watched from a propped-up position. When I got into this position, I started to hear the subtle creak of the small closet door. I looked over, and sure enough, it was now propped open. Not thinking much of it, I kept watching the cartoons. Then I could have sworn I heard something from within the closet. Just as I was about to dismiss this, my sisters looked back at me saying, "Sissy, what's in the closet?" The door was a bit more open now, and they said they could hear someone in there. That someone was talking to us. I didn't hear anything, at least not clearly, but I for sure felt something. "I don't know. What are they saying?" I asked them. They just began to laugh. At first, this eased the situation, but then their laughing got erratic and loud. I kept asking them to please be quiet, but they wouldn't. This was not like them. Though very young, they understood the consequences of being loud and always tried their hardest with me. They started to shake the bed, so I jumped off, ran over, closing the closet door. They both looked at me and just started screaming at the top of their lungs. I was in full panic mode at this point, so I grabbed them and I ran us all out of the room and into the bathroom. I immediately started to run the bath water, hoping that somehow this sound would counteract the noises that my sisters were making, hoping that I could save us from total punishment. As soon as we were in the bathroom, I noticed that the girls stopped crying. They seemed to snap out of it. They stood in the bathroom in front of me and the bathtub, I calming them down, saying that it was all going to be okay. They calmed down quickly as they were back to their normal selves. It was like they had no idea what had just happened in the room. I asked them if they remembered what they were being told, what was in the closet. They just began to tear up and asked if we could please not go back in there. And so we didn't. And when we told our mom, she didn't dismiss our story. Instead, she agreed to sleep in that room and give us the living room. But after what I can only imagine was an experience of her own, she too retreated to the living room. And for the remainder of the time that we lived there, the whole household lived in the living room. Well, except for whatever was in that closet. I don't really know what to call this story, but it gives me the creeps to this day, so I thought I'd share. A few years ago, back in 2015, my boyfriend at the time and I got to stay at my parents' house alone for 2 weeks. We were both seniors at the time and hadn't had places of our own, so to have the house to ourselves when the rest of the household was gone was amazing. I had to stay behind for work, but also to watch the animals. Obviously, I was excited to get to have time with my boyfriend. Some backstory on him, though. We'll call him Eric. He was a sleep talker, and this was a nightly thing. Most of the time, I could sleep through it. Sometimes I'd have to wake him up, and most of the time, I found it hilarious. Until about the third night. of staying at my parents'. It started great. We decided to have a movie night. We set up the TV, moved furniture, put the air mattress in the living room, with tons of pillows and blankets, complete with an array of sweets and, of course, popcorn. After we watched a couple movies, we ended up passing out in the living room in front of the TV. I remember waking up because I had to pee. This wasn't weird in itself, but I remember feeling scared about going to the bathroom for some reason. I brushed it off as me being half asleep, in the dark, and I went to the bathroom anyways. When I came back, just as I was kneeling down onto the air mattress, I hear my boyfriend loudly say, "No, stop." Of course, knowing he talks in his sleep, I continue to try to get into the mattress, when suddenly he reaches his arm out, pushing me back, preventing me from getting in the bed, and says, "No, Bree, don't get in the bed. I just felt something when you weren't there." I'm slightly confused. Usually he's not so coherent when he's sleep-talking, and he never says my name. He bolts up from the bed and switches the lamp closest to him on. He now looks like he just woke up. He looks at me, then back at the bed. "What was that?" he asks me. But he sounds like he's been running. And when I tell him what just happened, he says he knows. But then he says that the thing he saw began to grab me, and he felt as though he was sinking into the air mattress. We're both confused. I tell him he was probably dreaming about that part, but he recounts exactly what he saw, what he felt, before I came back into the bed, and even what he said when I did come back. As I stood there, letting all of this sink in, I noticed the bedsheet start to ripple, like something had sat down on it. Or no, like they were laying in it. I didn't want to take my eyes away, but I had to look at my boyfriend. When I did, I was startled that he was staring directly at me, and he said, "I told you something is here." I just looked back at the sheet and tried to convince myself I didn't know what I saw, but I was scared too. Then my boyfriend just hops back into bed. All the while, I'm staring at him. I watch him close his eyes and literally start sleeping. I walked over to his side of the mattress, shaking him, saying his name repeatedly. Then he opens his eyes, but remains laying down. I say his name one last time, questioning if he's awake. He says in the creepiest voice, "Eric's not here." Before he could even finish that creepy sentence, I interrupt him by screaming his name and giving him a heavier shake. I see him actually begin to wake up, and he looks at me, asking me what the hell's going on and why are all the lights on. Needless to say, I have to recap everything for him, but I ask him to first get out of the bed and follow me to the kitchen. After I tell him everything, he's thoroughly freaked out. He doesn't recall any of it, but he believes me. We both spend a good amount of time staring at the sheets, waiting for something to happen again. And though nothing else does, neither one of us can bring ourselves to sleep on the air mattress. We decide to go into the guest room, where we'd been sleeping prior to that night. For the rest of that night, my boyfriend didn't sleep talk at all. But the next day, he'd tell me that was because he didn't sleep at all. Like I said in the beginning, I don't know what to call this experience. All I know is that I felt something really negative that night. And part of me can't help but wonder if my ex-boyfriend brought something with him. I lived in that house my whole life and even years after this event, but wouldn't experience anything like that again. Moving sheets aside, I could never get past what my boyfriend might have said if I let him finish that creepy sentence. I have these experiences of seeing strange things in the sky and losing time. My first sighting was when I was 10, and I saw a massive floating ship that was shaped like a huge manta ray. When I saw it, I felt like I had been looking at it for a long time, but I shook that feeling and ran home. The memory of this surfaces periodically, and sometimes I think I can remember what the inside of the ship looks like I'd been there. And I remember not being alone in the ship, but I have no idea who I was with. Much later, I saw a craft landing in the cow pastures at my parents' house in the rural country. I felt compelled to go inside the house, and when I did, it was like I'd forgotten what I'd seen. I lost a few hours of time that day, and for a while I assumed that I must have watched TV, but later I'd realized that I literally had no memory of the last few hours. Later, I began seeing lights in the sky and would just ask out loud, "Are you here for me?" And the light would bob and weave up and down, left to right, or it would flash brighter for just a moment. Again, I would go inside, and soon after, I would lose memory of what I was doing for the next few hours. This happens often, even to this day. I know it all sounds a bit foggy, but that's really how it is for me. It's like I can remember these intense visions, but then I lose a ton of time. And sometimes I remember parts of conversations with people, good conversations, but then I can't remember any faces of the people that I was talking to. Like these were conversations planted in my head, but I don't have any real memory of them. I used to be very scared by these experiences, but I'm not so fearful anymore of the encounters. I'm aware that they're taking place. I just don't know if I'm ready to remember all of it yet. I come from a large family. My mother raised Catholic and my father an atheist, with all of us kids being agnostic at best. The house we grew up in was pretty old, built just before 1920. Over time, I became familiar with the spirits that lived in or around the home. I wouldn't be so fearful. But the beginning was a different story. I was young, unaware, and sometimes alone. My older sister, 3 years older, she had the most experiences, and myself being second. This was because most of the spirits liked our bedroom the most, and for a while we shared a room. The room had a high vaulted ceiling, tall, skinny windows, and a creaky wooden floor. It also had a piano in it. When I was about 6 and my sister 8 or 9, we had just moved into this room. One of our younger brothers was just born and would be taking my old room, while my older brother would be getting a room of his own, at least for the time being. In our home, you never had your own room for too long, that's for sure. I don't know how long we'd been sleeping in the room before the ruckus started, but I know the first thing that scared us was the piano. It sat against the wall opposite of our beds in the room, with nothing around it. We were laying there laughing about nothing when all of a sudden we heard a few notes play on the piano. Not like something had fallen on the piano, more like a short tune. We weren't laughing any longer, and I was previously rolling around on the floor, but now had jumped back up into bed and hopped over to my sister's bed, which was the furthest from the piano. Then as we sat there in silence, we heard what sounded like something beginning to pace back and forth on our wooden floor, followed by more piano. Being young, I began screaming. Shortly after, my sister followed suit. She was yelling with purpose, though, screaming, "Mom, Dad, get in here." Of course, this piano playing didn't happen once they arrived. and naturally, they thought it was some sort of ruse to stay up past our bedtime. We found ourselves being scolded about acting this way in our new room, our parents telling us we'd end up sharing a room with the baby or our little sisters. My sister and I ended up pushing our beds closest together and putting several nightlights in our room. We also started to close the top of the piano, hoping that this would stop whatever it was from playing it. We learned quickly this wouldn't make a difference, though. We continued to experience this type of trickery throughout our time as children in the home. It wasn't every night, but many nights were filled with creaking floors and a few high keys on the piano. Sometimes this would happen during the day, too, and one time was absolutely undeniable, even though our parents refused to properly acknowledge it. We had all been in the living room getting ready to take Christmas photos. As our photographer was repositioning us, you could hear a small tune being played from the piano upstairs in our room. We were all accounted for, though. We even have the Christmas photos to prove it. My sister had named this ghost or spirit Lester. I don't know where the name came from, and she can't recall either, but it always stuck with us. We ended up liking Lester. He was good, but once we accepted that something was there, we understood it to be friendly. Even though I could tell this wasn't a malevolent spirit, it still creeped me out at a young age, and as a result, I developed insomnia. I would stay up super late in the TV room, watching old reruns of TV shows until I was ready to drop. Then I'd either pass out in there or eventually go to bed. One evening, when we were a bit older, I was in the TV room and my sister was in the bedroom, practicing on the piano. She was playing the same song again and again, but was having a hard time with one part. She'd mess up the note and start again. I heard her give up, eventually surrendering to the couch downstairs where I was. As we sat there skipping through TV channels, we started to hear the tune that she'd been playing. Except the tune finished, hitting the notes that she'd been missing for the last hour. We slowly walked over to the stairs, and then up the stairs. The tune no longer playing, but the two of us genuinely curious if our parents or a sibling was messing with my sister. We made it all the way to our room and could clearly see that no one was upstairs. We walked over to the window and could see that our family was still outside in the garden. I decided to leave the room, as I knew this was just another incident that we wouldn't be able to explain. I continued watching TV while my sister played piano. This time she hit the notes. The next experience ties directly to this one, but also, in my opinion, involves a different spirit entirely. My sister would agree. The song my sister had been practicing was Blackbird by the Beatles. It would be a few days later that we heard a woman's voice singing that song. We didn't feel like this was Lester. We always agreed that he felt more like a young man, and he didn't speak. At the time, our mom was not home, so we knew it was not her voice. We were in our room, tasked with getting rid of some things that we no longer used or wore, so that when our mom got home, she could take them to the Salvation Army. I almost missed it at first, thinking maybe the TV was on downstairs, until my sister grabbed my arm and said, "Listen." So I stopped moving things around and listened. The voice seemed anxious. Even in singing, the more you listened, the more you could tell this wasn't a natural, human voice. It was missing all the reverb. Instead, it sounded like air, like the air itself was singing. And it was absolutely that song being sung. I couldn't recall any other experiences with this spirit, not exactly. When I asked my sister what she thought she named this one, she couldn't remember. What she did remember was the voice. She reminded me that she heard that voice often, that she was the one who heard it the most, and usually when she was alone. As she put it, because of that voice, she was too afraid to continue playing Blackbird, and to this day, it still creeps her out every time she hears the song. So, These were just some of the experiences we had growing up in our home. These were the experiences that we, even as adults today, are unable to explain. Being someone who has experienced what I consider to be true paranormal experiences, I'm also pretty skeptical. I'm not quick to trust my eyes, but my ears are super keen. They've always been my strongest sense. This was an experience I had as a farm veterinarian about 6 years ago while working on the East Coast. I was out in the fields with the cows. The farm had several new calves, so this time I was really just playing more than working. The property was huge, and just to reach the cows, I'd usually ride my horse out to them. So this was just before I decided to ride back to the main house and get back to my office. It was nearing 5 p.m., so lighting was decent. I say this because I always anticipated my next paranormal experience would be like my previous, taking place in the dark, at night, alone. However, before hopping on my horse, I hear something coming from the tree lines, just over the fence about 30 yards away from where I'm standing. It sounds like a puppy that's in distress. It's whining. My veterinarian brain instantly kicks in, and I hop on the horse, ushering her to ride over to the fence. When we arrive, I open the back gate and attempt to walk my horse into the woods, but she wouldn't budge. After having a standoff with my horse, she wins. I decide to close the gate and walk into the woods. I can still hear the whining as I'm going to do this. I look back and my horse is incredibly anxious. She was well trained. In fact, she was one of the horses I'd use for lessons during that time. She was the only thing that had indicated to me something could be wrong. I dismissed this, thinking that she was likely anxious because she could also hear the puppy whining. I kept walking towards the whining, now calling for the pup myself. As I try to pinpoint where the sound is coming from, I realize that it seems to be moving. I stay in place, and sure enough, I can hear the whining moving around the forest, first closer, and then further away from where I am. I close my eyes and try to narrow it down. Then I hear something rustling around to my left. I open my eyes and start walking in that direction. It sounds like something is whining and digging through leaves, dirt. I feel confident that I'm going to find this puppy as it sounds closer and closer as I keep walking. Then, just behind a tree, I see something that makes me stop in my tracks. An animal, partially covered by a large patch of bushes. A creature. It's hunched over, facing the opposite direction. I wasn't right next to it, but from this viewpoint, I could see that it wasn't a puppy at all. This thing was easily 4 feet tall, in a crouching position. It had hair, but patchy, and it looked like wires, very coarse and dark. The hair was not covering the creature's pale skin entirely, as I could see it. The best way to describe how it looked was that of an ape, except it wasn't stocky like one. Instead, it seemed very skinny and fragile. But it was making the sounds. And as I froze in place, it continued to make the sounds. It hardly moved except to tilt its head up when making the whining sounds. It was clearly visible that this creature was making the sound, but even more terrifying, it was making the sound from a stationary position, but I could hear it moving in different directions, just as it had been doing when I first entered the forest. The frozen fear subsided, and I decided that I needed to get back to my horse, then back to the property to tell the owners what I'd seen, though I wasn't sure what I had seen. Instead of slowly backing out of there, I decided to take off running. I figured this thing didn't come after me when I was making all that noise before, and now I'm actually scared and I want to get the heck out of there. I think that was a mistake. Whatever was previously far behind now sounded like it was right behind me, also running. I couldn't decipher which sounds were created by myself and which were coming from the creature. Never looking back, I reached my horse. I don't even bother opening the gate. I leap over the gate instead, cutting my pants in the process. Quickly grab my horse, who is now well on her way to freaking out as well. As soon as I untie her, she takes off running. Not what I had expected, but I took off after her, running in the direction of the property. I never end up catching the horse. I can see that she's well ahead of me now, so I just keep running. Finally looking back, I don't see anything. But as I turn around to run again, I heard a blood-curdling shriek leave the forest and echo throughout the whole area. Not even knowing it was possible to run faster, I did. Out of breath, sweaty, and looking insane, I finally made it to the property. After overcoming the initial fear, I tried to consider what it could have been. Does everything have to be evil? For a moment, I considered every animal that I could think of. I even considered that it was a person. But when I met my horse at the front, where she was patiently waiting near her horse trailer, I remembered how she'd acted the whole time. Horses are smart animals. Sometimes they're even a little bit too smart. But I decided in that moment this old girl would never act that way with just any animal or any person. I give her a nice rub, telling her that I will listen to her from now on as I load her into the trailer. Before taking off, I tell the owners what I saw. Try to, anyway. Asking if they've ever seen anything like that or heard anything like that before. The owners were pretty old, and though they said they hadn't experienced anything like it before, they were going to have the farmhands check the area, make sure the cows were not in any danger. This made me feel better, but I couldn't help thinking about the farmhands. Those were the people that I needed to talk to. The next shift at the farm, that's exactly what I did. And though a few were reluctant to even entertain my story, there was one woman who did. She didn't have much to say, but she looked very serious as she told me, frankly, I do not trust those woods, and you shouldn't either. I heeded her advice and never stepped foot in those woods again. This happened back in 1995, when I was approximately 11 years old. My family had a house on a golf course, and my best friend, lived in the houses on the other side of the course. To get to my friend's house, there were paved paths that the golfers used, but it would literally mean walking all the way around instead of just cutting through the center. Making a 5 to 6 minute walk, more like a 1 minute walk. It was frowned upon, but despite not being as well lit as the actual path, it was quicker, and that was the goal. As I walked back home and ran up the hill, my ears picked up on a low humming noise. It sounded pretty close. I looked over my shoulder, and just above my head, in the sky, I see a literal spaceship. At least, that's all that I can conceptualize it to be. It's got a round, disc-like shape, bright lights on the bottom lining the craft's circular exterior. It was dark, so that could be why the lights seemed so incredibly bright. I guess the best way to explain them would be that they gave off the same brightness as an LED light. Like most lights, it was blinding to look at. The shape, though. I had for sure never seen something that was actually circular, maintaining position in the sky. I mean, other than a drone, but that's only in the last 10 years, and this was in the 90s. I'm certain that there was nothing, and probably still is nothing like it, on the market. So as I see this thing, it's hard to tell how far away it is. It is closer than I think, and therefore something much smaller than a plane. Or was it the other way around, too far away to really grasp its size? Continuing my walk, trying to keep my cool, but then I realize that this thing is coming for me. I start to feel a bit uneasy, and then it turns to full-fledged fear when the low humming seems to get closer, and the craft itself seems to be getting closer. The lights brighter. I was sure that it was trying to make physical contact for whatever reason, but at this point, I'm so scared that I start running back to my house. I'm about 30 seconds away from the little walkway that leads to my backyard. I turn around to try to watch the thing, keeping an eye on the distance I've made. But I'm disappointed to realize I haven't put any distance between us, that it's still chasing me, closer than ever. What I can see now is that the craft is definitely smaller than what I initially anticipated. No way that whatever was inside this thing was larger than a small child. It couldn't be more than 6 feet wide, and the top seemed to have only a small dome, maybe 3 feet at its tallest point. Either way, I was still terrified at its speed, and more terrified that it seemed to have intent. As I stop at the path to my backyard, I can feel this thing is just behind me. The low humming is deafening now. I can feel my whole body begin to vibrate, and so much light seems to fill the area around me. I can't even see the craft any longer. It's completely covered in white light. I can hardly see anything outside of my own 2 hands in front of me. I know I'm close to home, so I keep pushing forward. I think I'm running, but I can't tell. And then, in what feels like the blink of an eye, I'm standing in front of my back door with my hand on the door handle. Once that registers, I quickly open the door and run inside the house. My mom greeting me, asking me why I'm so out of breath and what took me so long to get home. I had no idea what to say about why I was out of breath, and when I looked at my watch, I could see that it was almost 10 o'clock at night. But I'd called my mom from my friend's house, telling her I was heading home at 9. Somehow, a 1-minute walk turned into an hour. I have no explanation for the lost time, and I can't even decide what it is I think this was. I've never seen anything like that, and I've never had anything like that happen since. I can't even definitively say I believe in aliens, but I do believe that something of intelligence was controlling that craft that night. Really, I don't know what I believe, but I often wonder, if I could get back that missing hour, what would I learn from it? Was it something I'm supposed to forget? Or was it something I'm supposed to remember? That's all the time we have for this Friday's episode. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories, and thank you for tuning into The Darkest Hour. Be sure to join me every Friday night at 11 p.m., only on neoretrofm.com. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on Reddit, Amanda Jane FMN. Stay spooky.